I'd like to, ask a couple of questions to address about interactions with other branches of the government relevant. So with Susan, I'll have to bring up the Department of Agriculture. And for Gary, I'd like to bring up interactions with the Veterans Administration on some of the NIH projects. So Susan?
So I talk to USDA almost every day, quite regularly. A lot of it's on the food safety side, obviously. USDA is responsible for food safety for meat and poultry, and we're responsible for everything else. But oftentimes those things can cross. So we get contaminated chicken that makes its way into a product that FDA regulates, and we work across those lines very carefully all the time with USDA. We also work with USDA on nutrition-related issues. USDA has the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion and the Food and Nutrition Service Group, and we work with their career nutrition folks all the time. So we have constant dialogue when we have nutrition public meetings. USDA is represented at those public meetings. We had a public meeting about a week ago, and USDA was one of the speakers. So we work very closely with all different arms of the federal government, with the NIH, CDC. We work closely with EPA. EPA regulates things like pesticides. So we are responsible for enforcing those regulations for pesticides in foods. So there's a lot of issues that the government has a very close working relationship on, so I spend a lot of time with other federal agencies.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've, I guess, been a Fed for almost 7 years now, and I think counter to a certain narrative, I think there's actually a fair bit of interaction, as Susan was alluding to. Francis Collins convenes with the colleagues at FDA, a leadership forum where we do engage and interact. There's another space I won't get into in terms of tobacco and electronic delivery systems, where we have collaborative efforts in regulatory science that we work together on, nutrition task force, and so forth. A lot of the guideline things, again, involve us. So I think there are a lot of interactions that could always be better. In terms of the VA, I think there's some, there have traditionally been and will continue to be collaborative opportunities in terms of research studies. Clearly, even our genomic space, our TopMed program is looking to the Million Veterans Program for some synergies there. So I agree that government's a big place, and there are always opportunities for synergies, but probably more interactions than you may think.
That's very good to hear. Thank you. Nir.
So I'm looking at your own web, the NHLBI, NIH.gov, and the risk factors for heart disease that are smoking, blood pressure, overweight, physical activity, and diabetes. This is not true. The main reason for death from heart disease is aging. It's a 1,000-fold risk. Why don't you have aging as a risk? Number one. Number two, and related, why do you fund? Funding is on animals that are modified for heart disease when they're 2 months old. Why are you ignoring the biology of aging in your group? Why are you putting yourself to failure like the Alzheimer's did for years? There's no knowledge of aging in its biology, and no knowledge that biology of aging can be targeted in your approach.
Okay. So as I'm sure you're aware, and I think I put it on the slide, age is probably the most important risk factor in the Framingham Heart Study risk calculator. So I would beg to differ that we don't consider age as a critical part of that. You had Dr. Hodis yesterday. There is a National Institute of Aging. So NIH does invest a lot in aging research, and we do a lot of things collaboratively, and there's clearly overlap. So we appreciate that, again, this is a process over a lifespan, and certainly see the overlap. I take your point in terms of rodent studies, that there are clearly limitations of those preclinical models. I do agree that they may underestimate that interaction. In fact, we do some collaborative work actually with NIA in terms of models of aging and interfacing. I suspect you also appreciate that it's actually hard to give a mouse atherosclerosis because its lipid metabolism is totally different. So for lots of reasons, there's limitations in that model system, of which the aging element is actually only one modest component. But this is the systems that we have. And in fact, part of the reason why we're trying to promote the human resources, we now have the technologies to understand human biological processes in human beings as ways to identify those molecular pathways. So we take your point.
Quick question for Dr. Mayne. You alluded to this just a moment ago, but I'd like a little bit more color with regard to FDA's role in evaluating the impact and mitigating the effects of toxic agricultural chemicals that get into the food chain.
Yeah, so again, we have to work with federal partners. When it comes to things like pesticides, EPA takes the lead in establishing like tolerance levels, the amount that can be found in the food, and then FDA has the enforcement tools. So we sample foods. We put out an annual pesticide monitoring report where we test a lot of foods and we measure the amount of pesticide residues in those foods. I will say one of the things we're struggling with, like many of the federal agencies, is as technology gets more and more sensitive, our analytical methods can detect unbelievably sensitive traces of environmental chemicals in foods. Consumers will necessarily interpret that and say, they can detect it in food, therefore it's dangerous for my health. And that's one of the challenges we face in science, is that we can detect, unbelievably sensitive levels. We have strong teams of analytical chemists to do that. So that's one of the things we do. Some of the other environmental chemicals, I don't know if you just want to focus on ag, but environmental chemicals, we're also part of this big technical working group across the federal agencies looking at the perfluorinated compounds, the PFAS compounds. There's been a lot of news lately about the PFAS compounds. It's an emerging area of science. CDC, USDA, FDA, EPA, NASA, DOD are all engaged in this, and we meet with those other federal agencies weekly to talk about the research agenda and what we need to do with some of these environmental chemicals. We also are responsible for natural things that end up in our food supply, things like inorganic arsenic. It's found in the soil, it's naturally occurring, it makes its way into our food. So we have a whole program where we're trying to reduce avoidable exposure to things like lead and cadmium and arsenic that makes its way into our food. So my background is in toxicology and nutritional biochem, so that turns out to be useful in my job at the FDA.
Yes, my question is about regulatory reach. Today, with our age of longevity, a lot of people, millions, are living in congregate care facilities, whether it's hospitals, whether it's CCRCs and so on. They do not have food choice. And most of these, I think, are regulated statewide or locally. Do you have any impact on a federal level with millions of older Americans who really cannot determine what food they're going to eat? They have very limited choice.
So FDA is not responsible for things like the child and adult care feeding programs, but we certainly contribute science where it's relevant to those programs. USDA is responsible for food assistance programs, whether it be SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, some of the large feeding programs, WIC. Those are orchestrated out of USDA rather than FDA, so we don't play a specific role in that, but other parts of the federal agencies do.
And bricks and mortar congregate care facilities, no impact there. That's up to the individual chef and operators?
I am not, because that's not in my regulatory jurisdiction, I am afraid I can't answer that question.
And I no promise, no comment, but we won't have the population behind eating well or attacking aging as a disease, as the doctor mentioned, until we change our feelings about ageism. People don't want to get old, and they would not do what they should do to stay older longer until we reimagine what aging might be. So that's just a comment really from the heart. Thank you.
Dr.
Dr. Mayne, you have in the audience companies that are looking at consumer-facing strategies with nutritional supplements, and you have companies that are looking at drug-facing regulated approaches. Different countries have different approaches to how they look at the level of scientific validation for a supplement. I see that you're nodding, you anticipate this question. I'm wondering whether you can share with us, to the extent you can, the FDA's thinking about how it might do things differently than they are now about the divide, if you will, between natural products and synthetic products and supplements and drugs.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue, and I think to try to summarize, we basically have to make sure that we are following the laws that Congress passed. So the framework for how dietary supplements, for example, are regulated comes from the Dietary Supplement and Health Education Act, or DSHEA, that Congress mandated. So FDA's job is to implement the laws that Congress passed according to what Congress laid out in those laws. So that sets the framework for how we deal with dietary supplements and the strategies that FDA can use. The same thing happens on the drug side of the house, and so we are required to follow those statutes. Other countries regulate them differently. So we talk to many other regulatory agencies. I've had recent conversations, for example, with Health Canada, where they regulate supplements in a very different way than the US does. So in short, we follow the laws that our Congress gives us. FDA has said that we would like to do more in the realm of dietary supplements. Just as a frame of reference, dietary supplements is about a $60 billion industry in the United States. I have 25 people at the Food and Drug Administration who are responsible for dietary supplements. We have stated publicly we would like to do more in compliance and enforcement, because one of the things that we've heard from industry, consumers, and government is that bad actors are giving the entire supplement industry a bad name. So we are doing what we can with the resources we have available and with the authorities that were given to us by Congress.
Hi, Mark Santora. I had one question. I worked in industry for many years, actually worked at the FDA for a couple of years before that. I think your food labeling guidelines are really a major advance for most of my patients, but I have to ask one question about my favorite nutrient, which is vitamin D3. Every one of my patients can tell me exactly how many units of vitamin D3 they're taking per day, but I bet there's not one person in this room, so maybe you and I, who know how to convert micrograms to units. So I just wondered why the labeling chose micrograms versus the standard unit for that one nutrient. Sorry to get picky, but
No, I think it's an important issue. It's based upon a lot of the public comment that we had. As part of the update to the nutrition facts label, vitamin D is now mandated for the first time. It was not previously mandated on labels at all, but now it is a nutrient public health significance, so it is declared on labels. Also, based upon the science, people have been moving away from international units into other measures, and that's across these nutrients. So yes, it is a course correction. It requires education, but it's based upon the public comment that we've had from many medical societies and for other groups that we need to move into this framework. One of the other things we've done with the nutrition facts label is we've also required quantitative amounts rather than just percent daily value. So these are new educational challenges that we're going to have to work our way through. We've put out guidance for industry how to make sure they're making the same corrections. But it's because of the IUs that the IUs can be challenging to interpret that we've moved more into the quantitative measures that we have been recommended, advised, and the result of the public comment that we've had. And that's true with other nutrients, not just vitamin D.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to put an end to the questions because we're running 10 minutes behind. It's a healthy problem, but nevertheless, I apologize. I'd really like to thank our gifted speakers for giving stellar talks. Thank you very much.